Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Depth Insights, where we take a depth psychological look at news and events that are going on in your world. My name is Bonnie Bright, and I'm the host of Depth Insights, and I'm also the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, which is an online community for everyone who is interested in depth and Jungian psychologies. And you can find that at www.depthpsychologyalliance.com. So come join us. There's a ton of content there on depth psychology, lots of multimedia and opportunities to connect with like-minded others from all over the world. My guest today is David H. Rosen. And David is an American psychiatrist, a Jungian analyst, and an author, and he was the first holder of the Macmillan Professorship in Analytical Psychology. He is a professor emeritus of psychiatry and behavioral science and of humanities and medicine from Texas A&M University. And he has over 100 publications to his credit, including articles, chapters, essays, and haiku poetry, which I hope we're going to talk a little bit about. So he has a long-standing interest in spirituality and in the healing process, and in fact, he is best known perhaps for his research involving interviews of survivors of jumps off the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, and the therapeutic approach of egocide and transformation in treating suicidally depressed individuals. David, welcome to the show. Thanks for being with me today.
Yes, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, I'm really glad to have you here, and I wonder where we should jump in, but I'm thinking right now quite strongly that what has grabbed my attention about your work is what I just mentioned here at the last of your bio, and that is that you have done a lot of research around interviews of survivors of jumps off of the Golden Gate Bridge. And this struck me. I lived many years in the Bay Area in San Francisco, and of course the Golden Gate Bridge is such an icon there, and it is, at least in the region, I think, it has quite a story around it and an attraction around it on some level for people who may consider that as their only option at some point. I wonder if you can just share with us, David, as we get started here, a little bit about that work. Just give us some context and what your take on it is and how you found that kind of research to enrich your life and maybe make a difference in the lives of others.
I was a resident in psychiatry at Langley Porter at UCSF, and I had to do a research project because I was a chief resident, and they expected that. And so ironically, or it was synchronicity, there was a headline and a picture of a young man who jumped off the bridge and lived in the San Francisco Chronicle. So I thought, that's a research project. And so I set out to find, through newspapers, because all the names are listed in the newspaper. So I went back to the beginning of the bridge and then followed up all the people I could find. And eventually I interviewed 10 survivors who jumped off their bridge. And I'm currently doing a play. I crystallize all that down to 4 characters, 2 women, 2 men. The first set is 20 years old, and the second is 40, in their 40s. But the basis is from that research, really.
You know, I'm just taking in what you're saying, and I understand it probably started as a research project that you had to do on some level for your own training. But I can also see how something probably even archetypal, if you look at it from that standpoint, was kind of reaching out of the collective and really capturing your imagination about what this is about. And I remember reading about how you mentioned that not one of these individuals, as you followed up, went on to actually commit suicide after that attempt. And so I wonder what you feel like that has to say about the experience of these people. What were they looking for, and how can we I guess I'm trying to understand how I can relate to that, because it's captured my imagination, quite frankly, and I'm so glad to hear you're writing the play about it, because I think that this will bring it to a level where people, everyday people like me and others, can really engage with the material and what's happening here within this sort of archetypal expression.
Well, the concept of egocide evolved out of that project because one of the people I interviewed said, Dr. Rosen, here's what happened, I went to the bridge, went in the parking lot, walked out on the Golden Gate Bridge, and jumped and realized when I lived, and I interviewed this person in the San Francisco General Hospital. He was in there, and he told me that Jesus and his disciples came in the hospital room. And I didn't quite understand how that could really happen. However, he said it did happen. And he told me that the identity that he had when he drove to the bridge, he had lost a job and a wife, and he had no hope. And that identity, he said, died when he jumped and he lived. So that's how I coined the term egocide, because what happened was his ego identity died. Then he was reborn. So it was profound what he told me, and then I generalized that to listen for that, using William James as a model of just listening carefully to what people had to say. And that was a theme with all of them. And they all had a religious experience or spiritual experience.
Yeah. So there was something clearly coming through. I mean, these cycles of death and rebirth, even though it was not a literal death for them, the way that you have expressed this as the death of the ego really strikes me quite profoundly. And of course, we all go through mini deaths, I guess you could call them, on some level on regular occasion. But for me, at least on some level, it puts things in such a different perspective to really begin to understand how, I think on some level, we have to be able to allow that ego part of ourselves to die. And I think that's the work we're doing in the world, of course, all of us, the individuation process as it is really trying to loosen the grip that ego and all the conditioning that we have a little bit, just so that something bigger, more profound can come through.
Yeah, that changed my life, really, those interviews. And so I want to do justice to those people by writing that play. And so I fictionalized, based on the research, there's a man and a woman in their 20s and then a man and a woman in their 40s. They come out in the first act and share why they jumped, what the reasons were. And then there's an intermission, and I will write in the play that they should serve wine also at the intermission, because I think it will upset people, because I'll have it so that they actually jump off of there with the Golden Gate Bridge, a big picture in the background, and then they're reborn essentially, and they come back on the stage and tell what happened, what it means to them to live, to have lived and not died.
That sounds really profound. I can't wait for you to finish. That's going to be really fascinating to be able to really just engage with that. I should mention maybe for people who are listening to this right now that you did document some of this study and your work with these survivors in your book, which you're quite well known for. It came out in the early 90s, actually, or mid-90s maybe, 1993, Transforming Depression, Healing the Soul Through Creativity. And that is, by the way, still available even on Amazon. I know that.
Yes.
And you can download it by Kindle for those of you who are interested. That's what I did. And I'm interested in that title, though, David, because the title of that book, Transforming Depression, Healing the Soul Through Creativity, really was probably, I don't know if it was the precursor, but it certainly was a precursor to a lot of the work that you have done since then. Most notably, you've done a book with Joel Whitehouse called The Healing Spirit of Haiku. And I wanted to ask you about your experience of that. I mean, the first book, Healing the Soul Through Creativity, okay, I get that. So maybe that was the parlay into haiku. But can you talk a little bit about this process of healing and how haiku fits in that for you?
Well, creativity is essential because it takes all that intense energy, as you know, and converts it into, or transforms it into something as an artistic product, and that's critical for all the patients I see. They have to do that, and some are terrified and don't follow through. But anyone I see has to do that, whether it's a writing that they do, a song, or a dance. I've had people dance and paint and ceramics. Everyone has to do something because, as you know, any creative product involves that, taking that energy and converting it into something creative.
Yes, in fact, the connection I'm making here is with the haiku. Whether someone considers themselves a dancer or not, or an artist or not, or even a poet or not, haiku is such a simple and beautiful form that anyone can do. And even I find for myself, when I want to work something out for myself, maybe I can sit down and write poetry, and maybe it's even a bad form, but haiku somehow provides, I think, an opportunity to sort of streamline and really get to the very core of what it is that I'm working through in any given moment, or wanting to express, or what I should say maybe my soul is wanting to express. I'm curious about how and why you started writing haiku.
It went back to elementary school. One of the teachers asked us to write haiku because it's simple, like you said, and there's a formula. But now I've realized you don't have to do that 5-7-5. You can do anything you want, and I've evolved that way. But it started by an assignment in elementary school, and I just liked that genre. I liked writing that, so I've just kept notebooks, and I've written poems and written things, but I always thought that form grabbed me. There's something about the simplicity. So when I went to Japan on a sabbatical, I went to study what that meant, how it evolved, and so that's really what the healing spirit of haiku is about. I talk about that in there.
Yeah. One other thing you talk about in that book is turtles. I wondered if you could say something about your connection to turtles.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, in my office where I see analysis patients, there are a lot of turtles in there. And I realize that I have been drawn to them, and it may be their slowness, and I'm a little bit slow that way. And I just like always have turtles, and then when you read, like in India, the meaning of turtles, and it's just something that I've done a lot of research on also. I just like that creature, and so it's maybe the slowness and I guess the shell. So I must have a shell. Mm-hmm. And we all have a shell. We have our skin, which is a huge organ, but the turtle has that hardness to it. So we all have our armor or our guardedness in a way, and so the turtle has that built in. So we probably do also, and that's part of why I was drawn to that.
I agree with you, and I suspect a lot of people who are introverts probably relate to this considerably. But not just that, it's really about, from a depth psychological perspective, it's making me think of the act of, and the very much needed act, I should say, of reflection, or not only capacity for reflection as human beings, but also our really strong need sometimes to just withdraw into that shell that you mentioned and be able to dig into something that is deeper and larger than ourselves. Do you find in your own work and in your discussion about healing, and I think we should talk about this word a little bit more. I find myself stumbling over it a little bit at the moment, maybe AKA James Hillman, because he was not such a big believer in healing, and I know there's some mention in the book about Buddhism and how healing is not necessarily, it doesn't really exist because everything that is happening is suggesting essentially that we're ill or sick if we are in need of healing. So I wonder if you can just comment on that. I don't know if you made that connection with the turtle, but that's the connection I'm making. But I wonder if you can share a little bit about how you perceive the term healing, and if you believe in it or not, I guess I should say, in the way that I just mentioned.
Yeah, well, it comes, as you probably know, from that ancient, I think it's English root of to make whole. So, and that's really my whole interest in medicine and healing, is to help people to figure out how they can move toward wholeness, why they're here, and what they want to make whole in themselves and in the community or in the world, whatever they want to do.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and to that end, you, like the turtle shell, you are creating or have created, particularly as a therapist or a psychiatrist, you have to really create that container in which that kind of healing can work. And if somebody's not necessarily seeing a professional or doing talk therapy or even doing other kinds of therapy like art therapy or movement therapy, I find it so important that we provide and point to containers in our culture and amongst ourselves and communities in which this kind of work can take place. Again, allowing for reflection, but also allowing for whatever is needed to sort of come into this space. And I noticed that you have actually published a coloring book that for healing, and it's a coloring book for children and for adults. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, that grew out of earlier work, but I wanted to do that. It allows people to be creative and to be involved in the coloring. It's a story also. It's a healing story, but it's a coloring book, and I think I was drawn to that. I wondered how could you make a coloring book, and it's something that involves storyline, but also healing, which helps people. The story in there is about myself and my father, who was disturbed from the war in the Pacific in World War II and came back as a casualty. So it's about that as a storyline, but I wanted to do something that allowed me, the reader, the writer, to be involved in a creative process also.
Yeah, and I'm laughing because I can't tell you the last time I got out a coloring book and started to use it. And you mentioned before we started this interview to me that you were actually coloring in yours this morning. I love that.
Yeah, and it's ironic. My youngest daughter, I have 3 daughters, she said, "Dad, you always seem to be writing something that is in vogue." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, coloring books are in vogue for adults and children right now." I mean, and I didn't really register that. I mean, it wasn't a plan. They are very popular currently, which is fascinating to me.
That's fascinating to me, too. I guess I'm not in vogue. I haven't heard that, but it makes so much sense. You know, this is something, it's almost like the reemergence of something, the return of the repressed, maybe, I guess, is one way to look at it, in the sense that it's an activity I associate with childhood that I very much enjoy doing, and I think most kids probably do. And yet it's true, somewhere along the lines, as we grow up and become adults, we often sort of lose that.
Yeah. And if you Google coloring books for adults, you'll see these, some of them are even bestsellers right now. It's fascinating that this is happening now, which I had no idea about, except my youngest daughter, Rachel, told me that.
Well, it's good to learn these things, for sure. I'm going to go look for one. David, there's another book you've written, which is quite fascinating and really grabs my attention, and that is about Elvis. Can you tell us a little bit about your book, The Tao of Elvis, it's called?
Yeah, people don't realize that Elvis was very spiritual and explored a lot of Eastern religions. And that's really unknown because they often categorize him as a rock singer and not someone who was always with a book, often with something to do with spirituality. So that came from probably my youth in listening to Elvis, and then it became a research activity for me, like, how did this person develop all these interests? And so that led to research, and then the book about the Tao of Elvis, and that's how that started.
I love the title of it, and of course I didn't realize that you were going to suggest, when I was wondering about it, that you were going to suggest that actually Elvis was spiritual, because I was seeing some humor in the title, and it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, I guess. I can see that you also meant it seriously, but I know that you have a background as a stand-up comedian, so I'm wondering how that comes into your work in the world, and if that's also part of the healing process or the healing that you can offer to others.
Yeah, I think not taking yourself seriously, which I don't think Elvis did. He had a bracelet that had crazy on it, because that's probably how he viewed himself in a way. And so he was open to all different activities and religions and all things. I mean, if you've ever been to Graceland, I don't know if you've been there. It's not, well, it is probably as popular as the White House. I mean, people go there. But not just because it's popular, but it's fascinating to see someone else's house. And he had it for his parents, and one grandmother all lived there, and his daughter, and then his wife left, but his horses are still there in the pasture in the back of the house.
Mm.
And it's now in a poor area of Memphis. So it's ironic that all around it is a very poor economic area.
Yes, well, that kind of dichotomy, I mean, we're seeing so much of that in our culture today, I think, and when you start to pay attention to it, it becomes very symbolic of probably something that is in profound need of healing in our culture as well.
And there was something about that individual and the songs that he recorded, like that Heartbreak Hotel, and all the different aspects that stayed with me and then developed later into a book, a research, and so on.
Yeah. I'm coming back to a word that you used earlier, and we didn't really focus on it, but that word is stories. Mm-hmm. And the healing power of stories, I guess. You just told us a story about Elvis on some level, and you mentioned that actually in terms of the coloring book for adults and children, the healing coloring book, that it's kind of based on a story or storyline. What do you think about the power of stories as far as healing goes? And I mean, do you have any stories for us, or is there anything that you can share that actually exemplifies the capacity of stories for healing? Anything that I'm thinking about also the stories that you were able to garner from these survivors on the Golden Gate Bridge, and you must have a long history in your practice of hearing people's stories and maybe being able to even offer stories in return that have allowed people, in a sense, I guess, to change their own story, which is a big piece of it, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you said earlier, there's always death and rebirth in everyone's struggle. And I find that comes up often in therapy, in-depth therapy, that people are rediscovering who they really are. And that's been a theme in my own life, and most likely why I gravitated toward in-depth approach and Jung's approach in therapy, and starting with myself. But it's something that I think is inherent in everyone, that they all want to go back to, what am I here for? What can I offer? What is my gift? What is my journey all about?
Yes. Yes, and of course, so much of our own work stems from, each of us, it stems from our own experience, obviously, and challenges and things that we have to go through. I remember reading in your book, The Healing Spirit of Haiku, that you wrote with Joe Whitehouse, that you were telling a story, essentially, of how you came to write your first haiku. And you mentioned that you were in Ontario and you were alone on a rock. Can you recap that for us? Or I have it here if you prefer, I can actually read it.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. After trudging through a harsh early midlife crisis and a winter of much darkness and despair, in the spring of 1978, I wrote my first haiku as an adult. I was alone on a rock and overlooking Georgian Bay in Ontario, Canada. I'd been on a personal retreat in a remote place following an academic conference in Toronto. I'd awakened too soon when the birds started to sing. I threw on some clothes and ventured out on a path I knew well. I arrived at the stone precipice 30 minutes before the sun came up above the distant line separating the blue-black water from the peach-rose sky. I sat down and meditated, then got out a small tablet to make a sketch. To my surprise, I wrote the words below, creating another kind of image. I'm not sure why this happened. It may have been, in part, the fertile soil of my depression and the sense of emptiness I felt. Regardless as to why a haiku emerged at that moment, I'm grateful that this creative process has never ceased. For a moment, the emptiness became enlightenment. Like drawing and painting, haiku is an activity that heals my soul. And here's the haiku that follows this beautiful story from you. Dawn on a spring sea, then a glittering from 1,000 jumping fish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see the image. So that's how that started. That's correct. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You have an amazing body of work to your credit. You've written so many articles and books, and you've given us such a contribution to the healing process, particularly through creativity. And this is really important because in a culture where we are so focused generally on medicine and whatever the latest prescription drugs are to help us heal, and then of course as a broader culture, we use so many ways to distract ourselves and coping mechanisms to kind of bury the symptoms that are emerging in what's wrong with us. And depression, as you know, is on a huge rise. But you're a psychiatrist, and so you have access to a lot of the medicine, and you're very aware as an analyst or a therapist of the coping mechanisms that we all tend to put into place because things are sometimes just too difficult or we don't have the capacity to face them. But how do you think we can find a balance between these things, particularly when so many people can relate to feeling down or feeling depression or showing symptoms of depression, of something that's probably going on very much beneath the surface of our awareness?
Well, I'll give you an example of a patient that came in who identified himself as able to write poetry. And this is a person who is involved in teaching young people, and he hasn't been writing poetry. And I said, why don't you write a poem, and the next time we meet, you can read it and share it. And so he said, really? And I said, yeah. I mean, you identify yourself as that's your creative stream that you would like to work in. He thought that's what he did, and he liked to do it. And I said, well, do it. And he said, well, you know how we get those blocks of what you used to do, you don't do now. And so he came in with this poem the next time and read it, and I said, that's beautiful. And so now he writes poetry on a more regular basis. And it's something that gives him meaning. It gives him pleasure. It gives him, it's toward healing. I mean, it is healing because it's toward wholeness. So that's an example. And every person I see has to do something creative. I mean, they can take the pick of whatever they want to do. Often they'll go back to something they used to do, like painting or writing or even songwriting. And I've had people write country western songs, like when I was in Texas, and that is a gift because the country western music, they tell the truth in a small amount of words. I mean, it's really powerful. So that's an example of whether they write it or some would sing it or dance or different things.
Yes. Yes, and sometimes I think the awareness of just the fact that we need to do something different than just be in our heads about things, and or that capacity to just move our bodies differently or to engage in something that's creative will take us out of it or will move us to a different place. It's transformational, right? So I think the awareness around knowing that there is something available to us to be able to change something within ourselves, even if it's for the moment, temporary, it's very profound.
And it can be something that is altruistic, a great idea they had that they haven't actually put into practice. For example, another person I saw, an older woman, had cancer, and she wanted to kill herself. She actually walked in front of a truck, and the truck stopped like just inches from her. So she wasn't hit or run over, and she was hospitalized. And in the process of what she always wanted to do, she said, I like those harp seals. And I said, well, why don't you get involved with harp seals? And she did. She ended up working with Brian Davies and saving harp seals and going to visit them and drawing them and writing stories about them. And she lived to be in her 90s.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And you have to wonder if it was because she engaged with her passion, engaged with soul on some level, on a very deep level, actually, if that's the reason that she lived to be in her 90s.
I think
or
it was.
if it, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, note to self. Be sure you're spending time to engage in your passions, right?
Yes,
yeah.
And create something. And hers was to save those seals. So that became, through her, I learned so much about the harp seal and her work with Brian Davies, who devoted his life to saving them. And so I learned a lot. And she went through a real healing experience by devoting herself to that.
Oh, that's a beautiful story. Gosh, thank you so much for sharing that. That's really, really interesting. I think I'm going to carry this with me through the day, and it feels very rich and meaningful.
Yeah.
David, I know that the term soul making has been used in connection with your books. Specifically, I think it was Thomas More who was writing a preface or something to the haiku book, maybe. Anyway, he was using the term soul making, and I'm wondering what you think of this term and how you think it applies to the work that you've done over the course of your life so far.
Well, I think that's accurate, and when the ego dies, I mean, some of this comes from Goethe, who wrote about this. The old ego dies and the new true self comes into being, which happened for him. And I think that's always available to each individual to become their true self.
Yeah. Yeah, particularly if we're paying attention and allowing ourselves that kind of reflective space and we're willing to engage with the call of soul. Yeah.
And I think it involves creativity, Bonnie. And each person has that in them. I mean, you think back to kindergarten, for example, the garden of children. I mean, we always were encouraged to do creative things, to sing and play instruments and begin to write. And so that's in everyone.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Well, on that note, David, our time is coming to a close. I'm just so grateful for your time and for being able to spend some quality time with you. Final question for you.
Yeah.
What are you reading right now?
I'm reading a book by Thornton Wilder called Three of his plays, but he writes a nice introduction. And I'm sure that has to do with my own writing a play currently, and I just like to read about his life and his introduction to these plays. I mean, one of them is Our Town. And in a way, I was thinking about this play that I'm working on about the survivors who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. jumping into death and surviving that is actually, I mean, it's sort of like, in a way, our bridge. I mean, we all think of the Golden Gate Bridge as symbolic. It's beautiful, and why would someone go there to kill themselves? And so the other side is each person facing that in themselves and jumping into death inside and surviving and being reborn as to their true self.
Beautiful. David, thank you so much. I've been talking to David H. Rosen, who is a psychiatrist, Jungian analyst, and author. Wow, what a creative. I mean, you're obviously doing something very creative. So there you are, living exactly what it is that you're using with your own clients and talking about so much. You can find David's original book, Transforming Depression, Healing the Soul Through Creativity. That was originally published in 1993, so you might be interested in looking that up for everyone. And you can also find out more about David if you Google him. Actually, Google David H. Rosen. There's a Wikipedia page for him, and that lists most of his publications that are well known. And you can also find some of his books on a beautiful little site called Rosenberry Books, Rosenberry Books. And you can also find some of his lectures and material at his old, I shouldn't say old, I guess, David, but at Texas A&M University website, TAMU, T-A-M-U website. And you can read some of his work there and learn more about him. David, is there anything you want to add before we go?
Well, I still am an academic. I work through the Oregon Health and Science University. I'm on the faculty there, which operates out of Portland. And so I can't give up that sense of research and academia, which is strange but wonderful.
Lovely. Well, it sounds like a lifetime of work and definitely something that is pulling you forward, and I'm grateful that you're doing that kind of work.
Yeah, and thank you very much for what you're doing and for this interview.